So just to update you on where the Civic Society is at the moment. Welcome to all of you, first of all. We had our last executive meeting last week, and we obviously are preparing for the AGM, which is in June. It will be done on Zoom like this. We are looking for new members for the executive committee. We've had 2 resignations from the current committee. So if anyone would like to put themselves forward, if they'll let me know or let James know, then we can organise nominees, someone to nominate you and second you. So if you'd like to think about that, it's not onerous apart from listening to me and James, and David. But other than that, it's quite, well, I find it interesting. Whether the rest of the exec do or not, I'm not really worried. Anyway, as I say, we were arranging the AGM, we've agreed the accounts. I have to do the chairman's report to present to you, which is my homework for this week. Things that we're up to at the moment. The planning scrutiny group are still looking at applications, and the latest one that we've responded on is an application to turn the Ring of Bells from a pub with food to a food with a bar, with the possibility upstairs of either student accommodation or a holiday let. It's beginning to sound like the way of all things, but we have made some suggestions to maintain the authenticity of the frontage, and we're a bit concerned about the amount of space left at the rear of the building. Now that report, if it's not on the website yet, it's due to appear on our website if you want to read through it. And if you want to comment, then you're always more than welcome. Now, Lancaster Vision, which is another arm of the society, that's very much involved at the moment in looking at the traffic problems of Lancaster. Most of you will have seen the proposals by the County Council for amending the gyratory, as it's laughingly called, when it doesn't gyrate very often, of changing some of it into 2-way traffic. Now, we're convinced that tinkering with the centre of the city will not work unless we do something about the movement of heavy goods vehicles to and from the Loon Industrial Estate. Heavy goods vehicles can't come along the quay, and we don't particularly want them to because of the historic buildings. They're of an age where they're unlikely to have foundations, so the last thing they need is our heavy goods vehicles trundling past them. And there is now an online petition asking the County Council to consider looking into the feasibility for a new bridge across the Loon. This is to be at the end of New Quay and heading across to the end of the Saltaire tip, where the roundabout is by the Peugeot garage, which would then lead straight onto the Bay Gateway. So there would be immediate access away from Lancaster towards the motorway for people and heavy goods vehicles coming out of the Loon estate. Also on traffic, we're concerned about the transport of students from Lancaster University and the impact it has on everyone else going up and down that A6. And one of the suggestions we've made is to look at the possibility of a new railway station at Bailrig. It's called Ubeck Sidings. It's a stretch of line where the on the main line there, which expands for a brief period from 2 lanes to 4 lanes. So there would be a possibility for platforms and a train to be able to stop without interrupting the main line train coming straight through to Lancaster. We've discussed this with the County Council, and we're trying to organise a meeting at the moment with the university to see if we can get their support. So again, something to keep an eye on. We've been taking part in a survey for a group of historic towns that have cathedrals and a historic centre. We divided the questionnaire because the blessed thing was enormous when it came. We divided that out among 5 or 6 of us. I think, have you got all the returns now, David? You're muted for once.
Yes, yeah. Yes, we have. Everything's pretty well ready. I can collate it. It will be off in the next couple of days.
Right. Again, if anybody wants to see what that questionnaire asked, please just ask us and we'll happily send it through to you with our response. The Bainbridge Competition is a competition for school children in which they're asked to take a picture or do a drawing and having done some research on a particular building or site or historic site within the Lancaster area. Now, we've been running this for a few years and it's been a bit like pulling teeth, getting the schools involved. And so this year we're involving the guides and scout associations. And it's going to be pitched at Brownie and Cub level. We've got the support of all the guiding units in the Lancaster area. And we've just had confirmation from the Scouts Association that the Cubs are also happy to join in. They get a badge, which is the be-all and end-all of a Brownie or a Cub's life, are collecting badges. If we got entries from all of them, we'd end up with well over 100 entries. So it might be putting an appeal out for judges at some point. Amy has been sent the criteria and she's hoping, she's a governor at Dallas Road School, and she's hoping to involve that school in addition. So good luck to Amy on that one. Now that will be launched after Monday when that next section of lockdown is eased. We got involved in a request to do some research for plaques, the green plaques around the city. Somebody said there weren't enough plaques dedicated to women. So we did a big survey and we ended up with a list. I don't know if you can see that this, no, you can never works on my computer. I was holding up 2 A4 sheets of paper. There are 48 names been put forward. Unfortunately, for some of the people on that list, they're still alive. They haven't been nobody had told them, presumably, that you need to be dead to get a memorial plaque. So there's about 12 on the list of 48 immediately come off the proposed list. Cat Smith, for example, is one of them. Caroline Jackson, who's a local councillor, she's on there. So I'm sorry, ladies, you're going to have to wait a while. So we've got agreed funding for Sister Cox from the hospice. Francis or Fanny Johnson, that's the black servant, whose hand is separately buried from her body. We've got RSPB have agreed they'll put a plaque up for Emily Williamson, a Lancaster woman who was the founder of the RSPB. We've got money for Selina Martin, who was a suffragette and went on hunger strike a couple of times when she was imprisoned. And the other one, I've lost her name. Oh, Jenny Harris. We have a donation towards the cost. She played, first of all, for Lancaster Ladies Football Club, and then Dick Kerr's down at Preston. She was apparently a noted goal scorer and extremely well known in her time. We've had been offered a donation from the Lancashire Football Association, and we're just seeking now offers from perhaps Lancaster and even Preston North End, perhaps. So that's some ongoing work that's going on. And the other thing, because it will be coming too late before the AGM or by the AGM. Is Roger with us tonight? Can't see him on there. He's starting up his cemetery tours in June. He's got in mind the Sunday, the 20th of June for the first one. So if you want to know where the dead centre of Lancaster is, he knows. Right.
He's there. He's there.
Sorry about that. I apologise for that one. Right, now then, I was sent a bio of Peter, who is our speaker tonight. It was that long, I was considering publishing it. And I noticed that David had put the vast majority of it on his email, advertising the meeting tonight, and it obviously worked because there's 28 of you turned up. So I'm not really sure what I can add. I think most people know Peter, and if you don't, I'm entitled to really say why not. I've known him over 20 years, on and off, time of the Conservative Club closing in 2000. And intermittently over those years. Now he's involved in all sorts of things to do with buildings, and currently doing commercial energy assessing, which I'm sure he'll explain what he does. He gets time to do a little advert. But the subject of his talk tonight is 20th century housing, learning to love the unloved. Now that suggests you've got a job on, Peter. So I'm going to pass over to you. Peter Wiltshire, everyone.
Thank you very much, John, and good evening, everybody. My challenge this evening is really to take something that we take for granted, that we walk past probably every day, and to try to make it perhaps a little more interesting than it might be. I was born in a semi-detached house. It wasn't our house, it was my grandparents' house. And the reason I was born in a house is that I'm so old that it was before the National Health Service, and my parents couldn't afford to pay for me to be born in hospital. So that sounds like prehistory. So that was my first attachment to a semi-detached house. Then later, I grew up on a terraced street in Skirton, and across the end of that street ran Barleycop Lane, which had shiny new semis. They're not new now, but they were less than 20 years old when I was a little boy. And Barleycop Lane connected to the A6 trunk road, itself lined with semi-detached houses. And the A6 trunk road led to the rest of the world, a world of possibility, of fascination, of exotic places like Golgate. But eventually that A6 trunk road led me south. It led me down the M1 to another semi-detached lined artery, a conduit to ambition. It led me to the centre of London, where I thought I was going to make my fortune. 2 years later, it led me back again, slightly disappointed. But here I am. So I'll launch into the slides for you if I can get technology to work. As David well knows, I'm quite a Luddite when it comes to technology. Here we are. Let's have a look. I've put a quote on here, and it says, "The hardest thing of all to see is what's really there." It's from a novel called The Peregrine by J.A. James. I haven't read it, so please don't ask me anything about it. I came across the quote and I thought it was so apt for tonight's meeting. We see these houses and buildings all the time, but we don't take notice of them. We don't perhaps understand how they came about. And that's my challenge tonight, to try to bring this mundane subject somewhat alive, if I can. Can you all see the slides okay, by the way? So here we have a typical suburban street. This is in Skirton again, not far from where I grew up. And by the mid-60s, these houses, which were in the 1950s an aspirational thing, they probably had a nice new shiny Morris Minor on the drive in those days. By the late 60s, they were becoming almost a subject of derision. Manfred Mann, in his song Semi-Detached Suburban Mr. James, seemed to be pouring scorn on them. It has a wonderful line. I'm not going to sing it, so don't worry. It said, "So you think you will be happy buttering the toast for your semi-detached suburban Mr. Most." Some of you might remember that. Written by somebody called John Carter. It's actually quite poetic, it's quite good. But to understand these houses, we have to go back probably 200 years to a time when artists and poets and other scholars were trying to romanticize the British countryside. Artists like John Constable, who painted scenes in Suffolk. This is Willy Lott's Cottage. This is a photograph I took last year, but it's exactly like John Constable's painting. Life in rural Britain in the early 1800s was harsh, it was brutal, and there was real starvation. This was the time of the Tolpuddle martyrs, remember, and people left the countryside in their hundreds of thousands to work in the dark satanic mills. So there was this movement among intellectuals, perhaps, to romanticize rural Britain. Rural Britain is beautiful, but people had forgotten that they just saw it as a very harsh way of life. Now let's look at this little cottage and see why it was influential. Look first at the roofs. There's a lot of roof in relation to the rest of the house. and it's covered in little clay tiles, little English clay tiles, standard sized tiles. If we look at the gable end on the left, there's just a little bit of timber framing visible there. And the windows, quite small, but nicely divided up by glazing bars. And the walls are plain rendered. Now, this little cottage, well, quite a big cottage actually. I don't know who Willy Lott was, but John Constable painted his house quite a bit from various angles. Must have stuck in the minds of several people, because later on in the 19th century, around about 1880, the arts and crafts movement was born. And people such as William Morris and John Ruskin urged people to turn away from the over-decorated buildings of the mid-Victorian period, to do away with sculptures and Corinthian columns and other fripperies, and to go back to an age of simplicity in design, of honesty and integrity, of very high quality craftsmanship. And so this was the tenets of the arts and crafts movement. Famous architects such as Edwin Lutyens, Herbert Lucknorth, and CFA Voysey were very, very influential at this time. The houses they designed were generally for the rich and very wealthy, landowners, mine owners, factory owners, industrialists. And with the coming of the railway, those rich industrialists wanted to live or to have a summer house or a weekend retreat in a beautiful part of the world. So typically, they employed these architects to build these type of houses, a sort of grand country cottage with servants' quarters and huge kitchens and tradesmen's entrances, to build these mansions basically, but made to look like a cottage in areas of outstanding beauty. And you'll find them in the Lake District, particularly around Bowness. You'll find them in North Wales, in Dinganwy and places like that. And you'll find them in Somerset, one or two on the East Coast. But looking at this house, I want you to pay attention to one or two features. First of all, it's trying to look like a Cotswold country cottage. And the arts and crafts movement was largely based in the Cotswolds in Chipping Campden. You look at the roof, it's obviously divided up into various elements. There's a hip on the right, there's a gable on the left. It's probably covered in tiles. The artist here hasn't denoted that, but the lines are very close together, suggesting little tiles. And the roof swoops right down to the ground floor. This is called a cat slide roof. And this is a feature of arts and crafts houses. It occurs again and again, this swooping roof right down to almost to the ground. Windows that have a big accent on the horizontal rather than the vertical that was previously found in Victorian houses, and rendered walls. One of the most influential of all these houses was this one. It's called Broadlays. It's on the shores of Windermere. It was designed by an arts and crafts architect called CFA Voysey. Voysey built all over the UK. He was quite prolific, and the quality of his work was outstanding. Now, this was 1898, and let's look at this. This is an arts and crafts house, and it influenced really a lot of what was built in the 20th century, this one building. Hip roofs at either end, and for the first time, compass bay windows, which you see in lots of interwar semis. Little dormers, quite small in relation to the roof area, and prominent chimneys, and again, rendered walls, no brickwork or stonework showing anywhere, just bricks, nice stone mullions around the windows. Incidentally, this building is now the home of the Windermere Motorboat Club, and they do rent rooms out in it. I haven't been there, but I intend to. I think it's on Airbnb. You can go and stay in it, and it's rather, it's a seminal house. It's so important in the history of architecture. I don't know if you can see any of the script on this, not the script I've put on the bottom, but just up in the top right-hand corner. Voisey must have been quite an artist, because the notation there, where it says first floor plan, is in a really interesting font. It's reminiscent of the book covers of Oscar Wilde's books, which were designed by Aubrey Beardsley, who was an arts and crafts artist at this period, heavily influenced in the Art Nouveau movement, which grew out of arts and crafts. So this is an interesting building, and it's terribly important. If you get the chance to go and see it, do. I intend to. I haven't been there yet, and it would be nice to stay in it and get a feel of it. In North America, there was another influence, really. This was their version of arts and crafts. It was called the Prairie Movement. And it was led really by Frank Lloyd Wright, who continued being an influential architect throughout his long life. Now, the Prairie Movement flourished between 1900 and 1915. And this is a type of arts and crafts, as I say, but it's influenced by the wide open prairies. Look at the shallow pitched roof. Look at the very wide windows. Aren't they reminiscent of a weaver's gallery in a country cottage in the UK? And look at the arched doorway. I think that, you know, they were very popular. They were built, again, for the rich and famous, round about Chicago and Illinois, that kind of area. But they came back later to influence houses all over the world, even in the UK, as we'll see later. This funny little confection, or quite big confection really, is Whitelaw House on Morecambe Prom. And it's a little mix of arts and crafts and a bit of Art Nouveau thrown in just to make it interesting. We've got the cap slide roof swooping down from the right-hand gable to the ground floor. We've got all kinds of fancy carving, a bit of Art Nouveau. I think English Art Nouveau architecture is really just a decorated form of arts and crafts. People might argue with me, but our own Charles Rennie Mackintosh argued or called himself an arts and crafts architect or an arts and crafts designer. He didn't refer to himself as Art Nouveau, but this looks a bit Art Nouveau-ish, doesn't it? But built in 1898 again, bay windows, you know, starting to suggest something that was going to come later in the interwar period. Little clay rosemary tiles, which are popular now throughout the 20th century, but at this time, the late 19th century, they really weren't common in this area. We roofed out buildings in slate, or prior to that in stone flags, before that probably thatch. But these clay tiles were innovative. I do believe this house was built for the manager of the Morecambe Gasworks, but I can't find out who the architect was. But it was somebody with a quirky imagination. Look at the little window over the porch on the left, that little window under the gable. It's a poor photograph. I took it with my phone and I should have done a better one. It's been spoilt, this building, somewhat by this staircase tower, which wasn't original, on the right. And round the other side, there's a metal-clad lift shaft, which is even worse. But it's an interesting building, and it shows the evolution of housing styles as we come to the 20th century. Here's another little local gem, I think. This is again from about 1898 to 1900. It's on Furness Road in Heysham. The building on the left was actually the home for a while of the artist William Woodhouse, quite a famous local artist. But look at that cute little dormer on the front. Not much use, wouldn't let much light in, but a little arts and crafts feature, rather like Broadlays. And I particularly like the oval window where you would expect to find a front door. But can you see now the evolution of the semi? This is a semi-detached house. It's becoming something that became commonplace 30 years later. we can't really talk about 20th century housing without talking about modernism. Modernism led to perhaps what is called Art Deco, which I suppose if we think Art Nouveau was a decorated form of arts and crafts, then Art Deco was probably a decorated form of modernism. Now, this is the Casa Steiner house. It was built in Vienna in 1910. It looks as though it could have been built yesterday. The architect was Adolf Loos. You don't get many people called Adolf these days, do you? I don't know why. Anyway, he wrote in 1908 that ornament was crime. And he took the arts and crafts movement one step further and did away with all ornament. I believe his interiors were stunning. They were plain, but full of light and very well thought out. Adolf Loos went on to design an awful lot of this kind of building. This was his first in 1910. And he influenced a lot of people in the UK. A lot of people refer to the Bauhaus movement in Dessau in Germany as the birth of modernism, but really it wasn't. It was Adolf Loos. And if you want to see how influential he was, let's look at the next slide. This is Pullman Court on Streatham Hill, designed by Frederick Gibbard in 1936. The similarities to that previous slide are striking, only the scale's different. This is a court of several flats, very nicely designed, won awards. Frederick Gibbard was only 23 years old at the time when he designed it, as was Adolf Loos when he designed his house 26 years earlier. This even had a swimming pool in it, but this building alone really influenced the design of flats throughout the 20th century. Frederick Gibbard went on to design Harlow New Town in 1949 with its blocks, tower blocks of flats. So when we look at the flats on Mainway in Lancaster, they're quite similar to the blocks in Harlow built in 1949 by the same architect that designed Pullman Court. So there's the timeline going right through. Frederick Gibbard went on, of course, to design Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral and the Central London Mosque. So he was an architect of flats for most of his life, but flowered rather late into life into grander things. Now, just to keep you all awake, here's a little trivia question for you. And you can answer it. I can't give you a prize. I'll just give you a nice smile at the end. Who do you think designed the very first mosque to be built in the UK? Okay. And what year was it? For another 10 points. I'll give you 10 points for each question, but there won't be a prize, I'm afraid. Okay, let's see what we've got next. Oh yes, back to this one. Only because we've looked at Broadlays, on the shore of Windermere, we looked at certain features. Here we've got the compass bay windows and the hipped roofs. So Broadlays was, in my opinion, a very influential design indeed. Look at the arched Romanesque arch over the door. Now it's a shame, these are all right. I like this street because the houses haven't been mucked about with. Nobody's put any silly, funny shaped roofs on them or big inappropriate extensions. But as a member of the Civic Society's Planning Scrutiny Group, I became very concerned that we were getting applications to do all kinds of things with houses of this type, things that really messed them about. And I'm going to show you one or two examples of how I think we're getting it wrong and how perhaps future generations may blame us for defiling our streetscapes in the way that we are doing. But before I do that, I will just mention this pair of semis. This is very near to where I live, and I very much like these. Luckily, successive owners over the years haven't messed about with them, but this has a really strong arts and crafts influence. Look at the little oriel window on the left and the bays on the ground, and those windows upstairs, very arts and crafts. They've come from the architect's notion of a Cotswold cottage. And I particularly like the long, slim window to the left of the front door, giving some light to the hall. The hallways are oak panelled in these, and the owners, although they've done modification, they've left that intact. And again, you've got the last vestige of the cat slide roof that I mentioned earlier, swooping down that front gable, right down to the front door. I like those. Oh yeah, these are an interesting one as well. There are streets of these in Heysham, on the borders of Morecambe, places like Norfolk Avenue and King's Crescent. Now, if you look down this street and you half close your eyes, you could just about imagine yourself in northern France. They've got that kind of, you could be in a city like Valenciennes. Look at the roofscape at the front. They're an interesting house. They're long and narrow in plan, very ingenious use of space inside, tiny hallways, tiny landings, but every inch of space utilised. And just to make them even more exotic, although these were built possibly 90 years ago, they used a French roof tile from the Tuileries de Beauvais, a very clever tile that interlocks on 3 sides. Doesn't need nails, it just hangs on the battens. And I wonder, I don't know who designed them, I don't know how they came about. If anybody can tell me, I'll be fascinated to know. They are a little bit of exotica in Heysham. Well, but I'm a nerd, so I would find simple things like this exotic, but I rather like them. And then, of course, we have some local examples of modernism and modernised modernism, if you like. This house, which is on Morecambe Promenade near Broadway, it originally was just the right-hand portion, the square right-hand portion. It had a flat roof. And in recent years, it's had a pitched roof put on, sliding down to the left and covering an extension. Now, I think that's done rather well. It doesn't lose anything, in my opinion. And perhaps this is an example of how you can alter a house, but keep its character, even add to it if you do it sensitively. And again, we have another one. Just further along, originally this was a very tiny house. It started with the left-hand side of those curved windows and it had a flat roof. And in recent years, they've put this steeply pitched thing that sweeps down, covers up what was the garage, which is now a room. And again, I think it looks okay. I don't think they've spoilt it at all. It's got character, it's unusual, it's very steeply pitched roof, has an almost alpine look about it. And I think it adds to the streetscape, but not all modifications are quite so good. However, we ought to talk about social housing. Our earliest example in the area is, of course, the Westfield Memorial Village, built in 1923, I think, designed by Thomas Mawson, our very own Thomas Mawson, internationally acclaimed. Thomas Mawson was born in Over Wyersdale. His dad was a builder, and he started off by opening a nursery, a plant nursery in Windermere with his 2 brothers. And from that, he launched himself into garden design, and from garden design into architecture. He was incredibly good at what he did, and his buildings are found all over the world, Canada, New Delhi, wherever you go in the UK, you're likely to find something somewhere designed by Thomas Mawson. We were lucky to have him, I guess. Very much in the arts and crafts style. It wasn't the first social housing, I guess, because if you consider Bourneville and Port Sunlight, created by industrialists for their workers, I guess that was a form of social housing. But this was our first in our area, and it's a lovely example. I never tire of walking around. It is a kind of arts and crafts development, rather late in the arts and crafts movement, but there it is. It's lovely and it's ours. Later on, of course, in the 1950s, we got other big housing estates. Now, I rather like the Ridge Estate. I think it was a very good example of decent town planning. The housing styles were varied, especially the little corner bungalows. They were open plan in front, that the gardens weren't supposed to have fences round. I don't blame people for fencing off their front garden, but it does lose something of the original concept. It was based on a garden village and it worked really well. I think as social housing goes, the Ridge Estate was probably as good as it got and remains quite not a bad place at all. Now then, this is the kind of thing that upsets me a bit. This was a bungalow with a double hipped roof and it's lost its symmetry now. It just looks lopsided to me. Other people might have their views. The people who own it needed more space, but you wonder if they could have created it in a different way. The Lancaster and Morecambe are full of examples, in fact, all over the country, not just here. But I wonder what we can do about it, because it is spoiling our streetscapes. There's another one. This has been done for a long time. Two things here to mention. I think the architect on the right-hand house has tried. He's kept a little hip on the dormer. It's not too bad compared to some. The house on the left had its roof replaced in concrete tiles, which don't match the little rosemary tiles on the right. The windows have been changed. They don't match each other. I would like it, personally, if a pair of semis, at least if one pair matched the one it was joined onto. But people don't seem to do that. They want to create individuality. This is my palace. I'm going to make it how I want it. And somehow it just doesn't look right, in my opinion. And still they're doing it. This was I photographed this on New Year's Day this year. Again, a double hipped roof now being made into a gable roof on the right-hand side. So the whole thing will look lopsided and as though it's going to capsize over to the right, in my opinion. But hey, that's just me. And then you get things like this on the left. A pair of semis which had a gable front each. This one's grown this massive dormer, which looks like a wing on an angel about to fly away. And on the right, how they've changed the window. The house on the right, at least, has kept its rosemary tiles. These windows were altered actually in the 1960s, and I know the history of it because they did it to accommodate a sofa that they got, and they altered the whole front of the house to accommodate a sofa in the flat window. And the reason I know all this is that behind the window on the left is where I was born all those years ago. So that's my own history regarding this pair of semis, which don't match each other at all anymore. On the left, there were this, well, I can understand people putting a pitched roof to replace a flat one, but it would have been nice if they could have involved the neighbour, wouldn't it? Presumably, the people in the left-hand house had more money and could do what they wanted with it. At least they've kept that nice brick detail up by the front door, which the one on the right has lost. Yeah, again, it just gives it a sort of a shanty town look, doesn't it? They've spent an awful lot of money on it, but I don't think they've made it look better. And the same with the wall finishes on the right. In a street where every house is a different colour, that would have been fine. But in a street where there's uniformity, and then you want to sort of show your individuality by painting this very nice grey colour, but it just doesn't match. It just doesn't look right. And I wonder what it will look like in a few years when it's all aged. And will future generations blame us for letting this happen? Now, here's an example very near to where I live. and not a lot appears to have gone on here. There's a modestly sized semi-detached house with a building that appears to be the garage with a glazed front behind it. But when you look round the back, it's a massive extension, but it has no impact on the street. It isn't offending anybody. This extension virtually doubles the floor space, and it's very effective, but it doesn't offend anybody because it can barely be seen. And isn't this perhaps the way forward? Is this what we should be looking for? And finally, we talked about Frank Lloyd Wright with his very shallow pitched roofs and very wide windows. I wonder if he really did inspire these 1970s bungalows that we see all over the place. I'm not sure. Maybe you can tell me. Now, I've reached a stage where if I talk any more, I'm going to send people to sleep. So I'm going to invite questions. And let's see if I can bring myself back into view. Oh, okay, never mind.
Go back to delete that page and you ought to return.
I should. Let's see if it works.
Go to the top. That's it.
There we go.
Technology, it's a wonderful thing.
Oh, isn't it wonderful when it works?
Yes. Right. Well, personally, I found that very interesting, and I hope sufficient there to stir some of you up to either disagree with him, with Peter, or agree with him. And has anybody Googled the first architect for a mosque in this country? Did you say a tenner or 10 points?
10 points. 10 points.
Right.
Was that
anybody got any thoughts on that?
Was that 10 pints?
10 pints, yes. Sorry, 10 pints, David. I'll up it from points to pints.
Brownie points. If it's the one, I think it is. I used to live next to it.
Ah.
And I think you mean the Shah Jahan in Woking.
Ah, no. That's actually, I think that's a Hindu temple.
No, it's the mosque. It's Britain's first mosque.
Is that the one near Brookwood Cemetery?
That's on the other side of Woking. It's next to what was Woking Homes, next to the railway line.
Oh, right. No, I'm sorry, Amy, it wasn't that one. There are two very early mosques in Surrey, I believe, but this one's in Southfield in southwest London.
Right.
And it was designed by Thomas Mawson, our very own Thomas Mawson, in 1924. Now, I only just found that out a few days ago. I was doing a little bit of Googling about Thomas Mawson, and I found, just so that I could just give him a mini biopic, and I found that he designed this mosque. And I've seen that mosque. My son used to live near it, and I thought it was a much more modern structure. It's very striking, very Islamic in its design. So it just proves what a talented architect Thomas Mawson was.
Yeah, the Woking Mosque, I think, is 1889, and it's by Leitner. And it was built because Woking had what was called the Oriental Institute, which brought lots of people over from the subcontinent, and they needed somewhere to worship. And an Indian princess or Maharaja's wife paid for it, which is why it's...
I'll look for that, Amy. That's Wikipedia let me down yet again. But no, I'll look for it. It's very interesting. I know there's a Hindu temple in near Brookwood Cemetery, isn't there, near Woking, I believe?
Yes, I think so. There are lots of strange things at Brookwood Cemetery.
Yes.
Not suggesting a Hindu temple is strange. But anyway.
No, I know, but it's unusual.
Well, Roger can always organise a tour.
Yes. Shall we send him to Woking?
I think you'd have to warn Woking that he was coming. Anybody got any questions? Come on, there was enough thought-provoking content in there, I would have thought. I hope to goodness no one lives in any of the houses that he was criticising.
John, can I ask a technical, planning-y type question?
Go on.
Yeah, so when plans are put forward for changes of the type that Peter has highlighted and obviously disapproves, what kind of authority or lack of do the planning authorities have to approve or reject designs that, you know, materially alter the appearance or degrade it in the way in which you've described?
I think maybe James can answer that better than I can, because James has an encyclopedic knowledge of town planning matters, having been a planner.
Yeah, well, that's very flattering, Peter. I've forgotten most of it by this stage, but never mind. No, I mean, I think the critical point, I was going to say this later on, was that looking at the photographs that you showed, in my view, the vast majority of those wouldn't have required planning consent. They'd have been done under permitted development. And I think therein lies a lot of the problem. To address Amy's question directly, if something does require planning consent, then what generally happens is the application is submitted. And if the planners are concerned about it, they'll contact the applicant and they'll try negotiate improvements in that scheme. Sometimes that's relatively easy to do because, as Peter has indicated, a lot of people will suddenly wake up to the fact that they're potentially devaluing their own property by making a mess of it. But in the event where individual says, no, I want this, don't care what you think, and the local planning authority refuses it, then the individual can appeal. And actually, you'd be quite surprised at some of the things that get through an appeal. But the broader issue for me is that over recent times, over the last 10, 12 years, there's been quite an expansion of permitted development rights. So once upon a time, it used to be quite limited. I mean, just off the top of my head, it used to be something like 10% of the volume of the house. Now it's much more than that. And a lot of that was done as a sort of liberalisation measure. You may remember the bonfire of red tape and all that nonsense. So a lot of the things you see, people have been able to do without any authority, any planning consent. They would, of course, require building control approval, but then that doesn't concern itself with aesthetics. It's only, will it fall down? Is it sufficiently fire resistant, etc., etc. And the final thing I'll say before I shut up is you ain't seen nothing yet, because the Queen's speech yesterday, the government announced a proposal to bring forward a new planning act, and that's been trailed through a consultation document called Planning for the Future. And basically what it's going to do is remove the need for planning consent for whole new houses, not just extensions, in a whole range of areas. And this, of course, has been done on the back of, well, we need to create more houses, etc., despite the fact that some 1 million houses in the country that have been granted planning consent but have not been implemented by the developers. So the short answer to your question is, Amy, limited powers, but in many cases, no powers at all, because people would not require planning consent.
Okay, thanks.
Anyone else?
I got one point, just really not a question, but an observation. It's quite interesting to me, the two items on the seafront up towards Happy Mount Park. When I first moved here, the one in particular was as it was. And we had a little dog who loved the seaside. So every day I used to take her for a walk along that part of the promenade every evening. And suddenly they're scaffolding up at that house, and they appeared to be putting a roof onto it. And I thought, that's strange, you know, but okay, flat roof, I understand that. And as the days went on, so the side came on as well, until it took a completely different look to what it was originally. So I actually observed that one. actually being transformed. I thought it was fantastic what they've done, because it, you know, it was really quite small originally, and it's quite a large house now. But it hasn't. Its character is still there. It's fantastic. And if you look at it now, you would not know it had changed from the original.
Yeah. No, I agree, David. I think there's a lot of things that you can do right when you alter a house, but there's such a lot you can get wrong. And it isn't, I don't want it to sound like it's my personal taste. I'm trying to look forward 50 years and wonder what our descendants will think when they look back and say, why did they do this? Why? You know? Yeah.
Is that Liz or Howard? Howard.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the roots of modernism and high-rise buildings, and remembering St George's Works and its flat roof structure and its internal semi-independent floor structure, and its, you know, its relation to the modernist movement, perhaps.
Very much, yeah, very much so, because the modernist movement was based on really in the industrializing of housing. So they did really take their cues from industrial buildings, and some of you might have heard me referring to St George's Works as a kind of horizontal skyscraper. It was the genesis of skyscrapers. It was metal framed, a combination of iron and metal framing in it, which enabled skyscrapers to be built. Yeah, modernism and industrial architecture are very similar. Yeah, they fed off each other.
Thanks.
Yes, I agree, Peter, with many of the issues that you've raised, and very graciously you say, in my opinion, but I think, yeah, there's a lot of opinion behind you. The thing that puzzles me is this, really. If you live in a listed building, you use quite a lot of your personal wealth and expense to keep standards as we require. Materials are more expensive, more planners are required. You know, you have to think very carefully for the national good that such buildings are preserved. Now, we'd have to bring the same kind of approach to that, to our community housing, wouldn't we? At the moment, if you live in a house that's isolated from others, it's probably easier to do things. If we want people who live in streets and roads in the center of a community, and we want them to keep them the same, we'd have to work out what our priorities for architecture of homes and social housing would be, really. Do you think?
Yeah, yes, I agree. I think what we need is a kind of change of attitude, a collective awareness that we have a duty to maintain and look after our streetscapes and to leave something worthwhile behind us. Yes, I agree entirely with what you're saying there, John. I don't know where it can come from. If it can't be enforced by authorities, perhaps people should just be encouraged to think twice before they do something which, not thinking of my taste, I'm just thinking of the good of the community, something that's harmonious with its surroundings rather than jarring.
Yeah, I mean, you didn't really explore rightly that the people returning from the war came back to rented accommodation largely, even early semis, rented accommodation. Then with the whole rise of independence and feel-good factors and responsibility towards extended families, people began to buy their semis at £750 a time. You know, but that was a whole movement going on at the same sort of time, wasn't it, really?
Yes, it It was. I remember. I mean, I'm old enough to have seen so many changes. You know, in the 50s, a semi-detached house was really something to be aspired to and to aim for. It was some motivation to make you ambitious. And within 15 years, it was completely the opposite. It was strange, but yeah, a big rise, as you mentioned, John, in social housing. Most of it quite good. Some of it system built, which had its problems at that period. And that's a whole other subject, but a fascinating one.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? No? In that case, I'd like to thank you, Peter, for that. It's obviously a lot of research required, and you know, it is fascinating. It is something that, as a civic society, we should be concerned about what our streetscapes will look like in the future, long after we've gone. But as James points out, we have seen from on high, from central government, to be being prevented from having any influence at all in what goes on around us. And it's a shame. In the mad rush to build millions of houses, we're allowing anything to happen to the existing stock. So can I ask that we show our appreciation of Peter in the usual way? You can turn your sound on and then we can hear you if you like. Thank you, Peter. I really appreciate that. Now, our next speaker, of course, will be at the AGM, and that is, oh Lord, I saw your email this morning confirming it, James. Mark, what's his?
It's Mark Cassidy,
That's
who's
it.
the head of planning at City Council.
So he'll be coming, so there'd be an opportunity to ask some of the questions that you could have been asking Peter, and he can explain from the City Council's point of view. So it's still a nice night, so have a safe journey home, and thank you for coming tonight.